So Stephen, you are the director of life sciences industry, founder and executive director, and you are the head of virtual human modeling for Dassault Systems, bringing more than 30 years of experience in the development of computation science and engineering software. So no, it's on you to talk to us about your work and what you're currently doing. So you have 10 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes and counting. Thank you very much, and I really want to appreciate everyone for inviting me and taking the opportunity to share the work that I've been doing. It's a little different from what we've heard in the morning, maybe a little bit more personal. Maybe if we can get the next slide. What I've been doing is looking at how we can actually create a tipping point, a positive one. We heard about the potential for positive and negative tipping points. My focus, and in many ways the focus of my company, Dassault Systèmes, is to kind of create these tipping points when we believe there can be value. And in many ways what we do is actually use the virtual world and this idea of a virtual twin, a digital representation of some physical object to help improve the world. And we heard some examples, models in many ways represent virtual representations of real things, and they help us do interesting experiments. Well, what I've been doing is seeing if we can apply that actually to you and me, to our body. So next slide. So if I really think about what our company does, what we really do is we kind of empower the human imagination. We use the virtual world to let what happens in our minds and bring it to life. We allow the virtual world, you can imagine what it is that you're trying to solve. Our roots come from the aerospace industry originally, so we have a lot of examples of how we've helped solve some very technical challenges in the aerospace industry. But the idea is to use what's in your imagination, combine it with the fundamental laws of nature, laws of physics and chemistry, and try to take those ideas and bring them as close as possible to life. And so we've been doing that now for 30 or 40 years. We all, of course, benefit by safer cars, safer planes, and hopefully personal transportation, which you see featured here. Okay, next slide. So what has this actually done? So in manufacturing, where, as I said, we started in aerospace, but of course, something that industries like the automotive industry have really taken this technology to a whole new level, where we all have seen car crashes. And if we think about unpredictable environments, a crash of a car is what you would think would be the most unpredictable that might happen. But actually, we've learned how to predict it quite well. And in fact, today, nearly 99% of all car crashes that are done for development of cars actually occur on virtual cars, not on real cars. And then they take those virtual prototypes and build the real car, and then of course do that final 1% of testing. And they all pass. We were getting to a point where we know exactly what will happen, even in these very unpredictable environments with the patient, with the driver, with occupants. They can be children. We can do that all in the virtual world. But if we look in healthcare, which is where I'm focusing, we don't have anywhere near the same predictability. When new drugs or medical devices are tested, far less than half of them actually pass the test. And we're using those clinical trials as a learning exercise rather than a validating exercise. And so the question is, why in these medical areas we don't have the same kind of richness of our models? And when I look at the two industries, the automotive industry has very robust models, but the biomedical industry had very limited models. In this case, looking at cardiovascular models, very simplistic models of the heart. So next slide. So I wondered whether the challenge was whether we didn't understand how the human body worked well enough to build these models, or whether there was some way that we approach the industry different. In healthcare and in the study of the human body, we know it's very fragmented. We have research that happens in academia, we have industry studying, we have, of course, the doctors and hospitals that are collecting lots of data on a day-to-day basis about the human body, but it's all fragmented. And I wondered if we could all work together on a single model of the human heart, whether we took all our pieces together, we knew enough to actually rebuild an entire heart the way we can rebuild an entire car or a plane. And so I launched, next slide, I launched a project I called the Living Heart Project, which was to see if we could combine all of our knowledge into a single representation and then share that back to everyone. So basically crowdsource the development of a human heart. So the project brought together these 4 communities. I had to use the virtual twin as a way of allowing the clinicians to talk to researchers that might be looking at tissue mechanics or electrophysiology, where the clinician is looking at an entire organ or body. And so these virtual models really help bring it all together. Next slide. So I launched that project back in 2014, so 6 years ago, before digital health was really something people were talking about. And I knew to build a heart, I needed to create many scales. So you can look at the heart or the body at the organ level, you can the tissue level, the cell level, the genetic, the DNA. And the goal was to produce all of that so that we could actually produce a fully functioning human heart. And so by crowdsourcing all the knowledge together and using this idea of a virtual twin, I brought all the pieces together, and actually within 1 year, we were able to create an entire functioning human heart, which is now available. We've taken that prototype heart and actually made it available commercially. So anyone now, whereas the knowledge used to be segmented in the minds and hard disks of people around the world, it's actually all in a particular place. So you can just download it from the cloud and actually get it and start doing things like testing new devices and new treatments right on a human heart, the way they could test crash a car. Next slide. So, so this community, the ecosystem that we were able to build, now have access, instead of the piece of the model that they were able to do, they're actually able to look at that model in the context of the entire behavior of a human heart. And so the community can now test it on all of these different aspects. Pretty much any health challenge you might have and a treatment protocol you can actually test in the virtual world as a predecessor to actually trying it into the real world. And because everybody is working on the same human representation, created kind of a reference for the human anatomy, we can combine that information because people are working on the same model, not their own model. And they can immediately reapply it. So if something's published, that data can be immediately reused. And so we have this sort of snowball effect in terms of our understanding of how the human heart works. Next slide. So we began, many of those examples, we began with very more straightforward medical devices where the function might be more straightforward, like a artificial valve. We know how a valve works. This is an example where the heart was taken to the next level of detail to actually look at what happens when drugs interact with it. So a topic called cardiotoxicity. So it's actually the #1 reason drugs fail in the market. If it actually affects the conductivity in the heart when it goes into clinical trial, whether it's a heart drug or not, it's immediately rejected by the regulatory authorities because that's so fundamental to life. So we were able to take our model and look at what happens, in this case, looking at a beta blocker, where it blocks the beta channels, the ions conducting in the cells. So the model goes down all the way to the ion channels and then builds it all the way up to the entire organ. So you can actually look at what's happening at the output. The blood flow changes that are happening as a result of the drug. And so now you can actually test your drugs on virtual humans before you actually have to find out, potentially 10 years or $1 billion later. Next slide.
Yeah, one more minute, Steve.
Okay. Go quickly. So we've applied these. This technology is now making its way into clinical. So on the left, you see an example where it's actually started being used to help address the COVID challenge. We know cardiovascular problems were an issue. On the right, very complex congenital heart defect reconstructions can be practiced on the computer before on the real patient, and these have been shown to be predictive and in many cases more reliable than the surgeons themselves. Next slide. So the hope is this reference really changes, again, a tipping point where we think about the human anatomy, where you can actually share the information for all of these different applications and combine it so that our own understanding of the human anatomy, instead of a mystery, can actually be a predictable science. Next slide. So I'll just flip quickly. So I have to acknowledge the members who are doing most of the work. My job is to organize it and lead. These are the representatives who are all working together. We're fortunate to have the FDA actually participate in the project. We're actually working with them now on a virtual clinical trial. So we're using the heart as a representation for patients. So instead of having to test everything on real patients, maybe we can screen or reduce the burden and use virtual patients. Next slide. And so, so my vision, hopefully, is so that in the long run, maybe each of us, or at least those of us as we age, we can connect our genotype to our phenotype and use these virtual patients as a way of studying and predicting diseases before they happen. So using accelerated aging models and predicting outcomes, we can actually change the premise of healthcare from treating a disease to actually preventing a disease. Next slide. And so I close with this idea is that healthcare has really lagged behind other industries in taking advantage of the digital era. We see it getting closer and closer, but maybe we think the virtual twin is that connective piece between all of this digital technology and actually the human body. And hopefully, as I said, create this tipping point where we focus more on prevention than curing. And so with that, I'd love to take your questions.